Okay, we're back. The 58 Impala, it's actually seems like a second or two, but it's been 2 weeks. I only get to work on this thing at night and on the weekends. So what you saw last time was this thing in pretty raw form compared to where it is right now. The car, what you didn't see was we took it off the frame rack. I got a forklift and a strap and pulled it out front and did some sandblasting, got all the paint and stuff off the firewall and the rust and whatnot. So the firewall has been seam sealed and painted, and I kind of cheated a little bit. I used a product, North Star, that's from our Fleet line of paint up at the paint spot. And Fleet means basically Kenworths, Peterbilts, you know, that whole area. And it's a direct-to-metal product. So I bypassed putting any kind of sealer underneath it, or the Clausen's product would have been overkill because you got to sand it out afterwards. So I did put a little bit of epoxy sealer, and I know I badmouthed epoxy the other day, but there's a time and place for everything. And cheating, especially when it's going to be out of the UV rays and you're going back to back with something that is waterproof and durable, that's an area that you can cheat. So that's what you see, a little bit of a black epoxy on there, and then North Star 777 series, direct to metal. Satin black, actually. So what we talked about last time you saw this was the need to cap this off because some of this would have shown underneath the bumper after it was installed. And so I did what I said I was going to do. I angle cut this down here, and then I capped it all in before we did the paint. Also ground a lot of welds and stuff on here. We actually had to put the engine and transmission in the car and get the transmission lined up with the cross member to make sure the drive shaft length and everything remained the same. And we did all that just so that we could mount this engine cradle in a proper place. So that was a little bit of a job because it was manufactured wider than what we needed to be. So we centered the engine and stuff in here, got all that stuff done, welded that in. These hanger brackets right here, we had to put those in. This is the front for the shackles, the rear is the stationary one. The core support mounts, I opted out of that little thing that I showed you last time with the welded nut on the washer, and it was all kind of sealed. I went to something like this. I acquired some different steel in the time since we left till when I welded these things in, and so this just made it a little bit simpler. We'll drop the bolts through here, put accessible, and we've still got the same amount of travel in there. So what you're looking at now is the front axle in it with the leaf springs and stuff on it. The axle had to be rebuilt, and it was sandblasted and painted because this is a 1951 junkyard axle. So I put new kingpins and bushings in here. That was a job, one side more so than the other. And then we've acquired a rack and pinion steering system. And I know I said I wasn't into buying stuff, you know, and putting it on here, especially Chinese stuff. This is an American company. It's what is the name of this place? Performance Online. They actually take a Ford rack and pinion, I guess a Mustang, and they make these brackets in here, these big aluminum blocks, so it actually mounts to the I-beam axle, and that basically retains the rack and pinion unit. What you can see here is a couple of pieces of tape. Those are basic marks to mark the center because I want to make sure I have equal adjustment on the tie rod ends, so you need the rack and pinion to be pretty centered when you're doing that. So once I achieved that, I marked it because I've got to take it back apart. The reason I have to take it back apart is this angle right here that connects to the steering shaft. It's not quite right, and so there's little or no instructions on this stuff, and I personally have never dealt with it before, so it's like a trial and error thing. This particular block right here is the one that has the little rubber grommet inside of it. It could mount one of two different ways, and so I mounted it on a bench and I mounted it the wrong way, and that's giving it about a 230 angle here where we need it to be about 1 o'clock so that we can connect with our U-joint and it's got a telescopic shaft that goes on there. A lot of people would say something about the steering not being able to work right, especially on a straight axle. as much into using junkyard stuff as I am, I didn't have the steering box. The pitman arm and the center link, the drag link, were bent all to hell, and somebody had actually sectioned the pitman arm. I guess maybe it broke and they welded it back together. So it would have been basically junk anyways. And I thought, well, nobody does this, so why not try it? So this is a telescopic shaft, and it's a little bit hard to move right now, but the purpose of this is to where when I make the connection, this can actually slide in and out with the travel up and down of the leaf springs. And then of course there'll be a U-joint on here to get the angle right. So that should take any of the problems with binding out of it. Bump steer is also a phrase that they use out there, and that usually comes from having control arm issues, geometry problems and stuff. Can happen on an old straight axle, just primarily because of the way they were rigged up with that steering box and that long arm and everything. So I didn't want that. The best way to do your steering is to have it parallel with your steering arms. And I don't know if you can see it from where the camera shot is right now, but the rack rods are coming out and they're directly in line with the steering arms that are connected to the spindles. So bump steer should be non-existent. This was the only thing that I was really worried about. So we're also going to disc brakes on the front. And that's what these brackets are on here for. So here's one of the problems with the aftermarket. The steering guys have their setup and their hardware, and then the guys, another company that makes this conversion kit, they've got their setup. So there was a little bit of a changing of hardware that needed to take place because of the two different companies and the way it all attaches. And all it really came down to was some spacers and different bolts on here. I don't really need to do a lot of explanation on that. For anybody that does what I did right here, you'll run into the same problem. It's pretty easy to figure out where it needs to go versus where it is. So because we're putting disc brakes on here, we had to take the old 4-bolt master cylinder that goes up here, and I was actually putting this off and focusing more on the front end because I wasn't really looking forward to having to cut up the firewall and refabricate that mount. But lo and behold, this Corvette 2-bolt master cylinder mounts right up to those lower bolts, and that's where that rod coming from your brake pedal is centered, right? And that's probably another reason that most people prefer Chevrolets to work on. Chevrolet was just infamous for keeping things the same, or very interchangeable over a lot of years, right? The only problem with putting this up here is when I put it up there, it leaves the top half of the hole where the 4-bolt master cylinder went. And that turned out to be no big deal. I made a template, made this piece of metal. That piece of metal will go on there. And the master cylinder goes on there, and bada bing, bada boom. I didn't have to modify anything. Okay, a little clarification on something that I told you about last time was the need for the angle on these forward shackles right here. I can show you how I did it. Now these tools right here that I'm holding are easily acquired at Home Depot, or in this case it was Ace Hardware, and I don't think I have 20 bucks invested in both of them. This, everybody knows what that is, every carpenter does. And this little thing right here was really cool. It's in degrees, so it's a little angle finder, like a manual apparatus. And if I had it to do over again, I think I would have opted for something a little bit different, or I could take a piece of stainless steel and weld a little lip on the bottom of this so I can set it up on something or come up from underneath just to kind of square it up. That would make this tool a lot more user-friendly for this purpose. At any rate, you have to put a forward angle on those front shackles. That's the pivoting shackle, right? And it all needs to be done under a load. Now, when I did set this up, I had a floor jack in the center of it, and I had this thing loaded to a point to where it was actually starting to lift up the car. So I know the motor and trans wasn't in it at the time, but still it was a loaded suspension. So although this is leaning backwards right now because it's unloaded, I do have about a 6-degree forward tilt. And if you didn't have anything at all and you just had a straight edge, you could line it up against those 2 bolts right there, and you can measure the gap in there. You see there? So back when I was putting the forward tilt on it, It was even at the bottom, and there was a gap up here at the top. And I basically went for a skinny 1/8 inch. And I know where that's at in degrees from this. This wasn't really any help because I couldn't mount it without that lip on it. So I've got about a 6-degree forward angle on those front shackles. And that's necessary, so if it was left like this loaded up, this thing would want to invert when it went over a bump. And if you're too far tilted out forward, for every bit that you're forward, you're going to lose a little bit in height. Probably 10 times that amount in height. So you don't want to be too far out either. Okay, so we're going to talk about the steering column in relationship to the rack and pinion spline. I don't want to cut up the 58 steering column unless I absolutely have to, and I'm going to do everything I can not to do that. But I can't deal with this angle. I mean, we've got a U-joint, we've got that telescopic sleeve that goes on there, but this angle is just not going to work with that angle down there. So if I'm talking in terms of a clock, from my perspective, this thing is at about 2:30, and we probably need it set about 1 o'clock. That'll give it more of a direct angle, and the U-joint and the telescopic sleeve should more than compensate for that. So what I have to do is, and I mentioned this earlier, that block. Didn't know which way it went. It'll go 2 ways. I'm going to turn that upside down, reclock the rack and pinion unit, and then we'll go back into it after I've done that. So one of the things I can talk about is long hair and these little creepers with wheels on them. Not a good combination. So now that you're recording again, I can quit cussing. Did I mention how big of a Trump supporter I am? Gee, you could probably tell, right? So that ought to get me canceled from YouTube. We reversed that block and changed the angle of this. And we're not even sure just how much farther it's going to go once that other end gets bolted up. But it's already putting us in the right direction here. Okay, so it appears to have changed the angle quite a bit. We'll see how much when I get out and tighten up the block on the other side. Okay, I made it out without sacrificing any hair. Okay, so I'm trying to get this bracket tightened up to find out exactly what we achieved here. So bear with me a little bit. Okay, so on the first video I told you that we cut the front frame section off the Impala because it was so badly screwed up. And I said that I would get you a shot of that. That's what we're doing right now. So this is the section that was on that car originally, the whole front section of the chassis. And the area of damage was right in here. And you can see what somebody back in the day attempted to do. It looked like they used, I don't know, a cross between a chain link fence and a barbecue pit to do the repairs. Really rudimentary, really unsafe, and it didn't work out. You can see where the ball joint's actually rubbing this wheel. And because of the white letters being on here, you can tell that the car was never driven. What they did obviously never worked, or there may have been other reasons that the car never drove, but no way anybody ever drove this car. You wouldn't even see these white letters. And these are the tires that were on it when I got it. So that was so bad, there's no point in even trying to fix that. It's also bent, so the geometry is not quite right. And like I said, I have the 61 parts car right there. I could have used the chassis out of that, but I just didn't want to do it. I wanted to put a straight axle under it. So this is it. And these are actually the wheels that were on it. We'll get a shot in a second here. These are original Krager wheels. And I'm talking they're the original ones from back in the day. They're in pretty bad shape, but they could be re-chromed and reused. I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. I like the Krager wheels, but I don't think it would look quite right on that 60 or that 58. Maybe I'll do it for another project. Okay, so I guess that kind of concludes today's little adventure. Hope you guys are finding this useful in some way. Like I said, I'm not God, I don't know everything, but I just got common sense, and I figured I'd share this in the event that somebody's even doing something remotely close to this. Also, the body and paint tips. Took me lots and lots and lots of years to figure this stuff out, and it actually took me opening up the paint spot where I was distributing some of these products to actually get a hold of the people that knew the answers to questions that I'd had going way, way, way back. And so my job is to give you guys that information, because for whatever the reason is, those guys and us end users are never supposed to communicate. So hopefully I'm bridging some of that stuff. Any questions that you guys have, you can always get a hold of me at rcpaintspot@Reagan, that's REAGAN.com. I welcome the questions, and I'm an open book. I'll give you the best I can give you. If I don't have the answers, I certainly know the people that do. Thanks. See you next time.